Well, good evening. Thank you for joining the Lessons of Vietnam show. We're trying to tell the story of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served in the United States military. We're trying to dispel the myths and half truths and downright lies. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran 6768. I'm a TET survivor. We are broadcast courtesy of Nissan Communications Worldwide Headquarters right here in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you have something you need to tell me or want to tell me, my email address is dixonbill80 at yahoo.com. Now, if you want to participate in the show, make comments, suggestions, whatever you would like to put into the show, you can call us at 919-518-9773. Or even better, go on to Skype yourself and go to computers 2K Voice. That's computers 2K Voice. And put your 2 cents in, work in, or whatever you'd like to do as we go through our show. The information I put out is strictly my responsibility. I'm the one that does all the research and so forth. So nobody else can be blamed for it or get credit for it. Also out there, if you're a veteran or you know a veteran, I'm sitting here looking at my crack service dog, Tank, who wants me to rub him, but I don't have time to. But if you're out there and you feel like you are in a crisis, please call the Veterans Crisis Line at 1-800-278255 and press 1. And it's important you press 1 to get where you're supposed to go. Or you can text to 838255. And then you have someone to talk with and help you out with the stress and so forth. So it's out there. Be sure to take advantage of it. If you have stress and so forth, be sure to get out there. Tonight's show is kind of random thoughts. I was in a hospital for about 5 days and been taking a lot of medication. So didn't have time to do all the research that I normally do. So something I've been wanting to do anyway. A lot of new members joining us now, and some of the past shows I wanted to kind of tell you about a little bit. So what I did was I went into some of the earlier shows, and let's call it Bill's Random Thoughts. That's what we're going to be doing tonight, and we're going to start out with something that means a whole lot to me. Vietnam veterans and the Burns and Novak documentary. Don't know how many of you out there saw it. If you saw it, you have my sympathies. Will this document become the official word in history of the Vietnam War as used by teachers to teach the Vietnam War? Unfortunately, it probably will because it's gotten all the publicity you could ever get. Ken Burns is this great researcher. He's done some great work in the past. Unfortunately, it didn't work with this one. It needs to be seen as a small, biased piece of the Vietnam War puzzle, but not the final definitive piece. There's some great photography in there and so forth, but we'll talk about it as we go. Okay. A Warped Mirror. This is by Mark Moore, author, Vietnam vet. Omissions and distortions mar Ken Burns' Vietnam War, a missed opportunity to provide an historically honest look at the conflict. About 27 years ago, Ken Burns mesmerized American artists with the Civil War, an 11-hour documentary that took 5 years to produce. 40 million Americans watched the initial airing, and many more watched reruns or read the companion book. The series rekindled popular interest in the Civil War, stimulating a flood of books and battle reenactment that continued to this day. So he kind of brought the interest back of the Civil War and got people interested in doing research. So I don't remember seeing it, but I sound like he did a good job. Burns and co-director Lynn Novick spent 10 years and $30 million producing the Vietnam War, an 18-hour, 10-episode production. It had to be hard to get all of it down in 18 hours in the first place. Anyone tuning into media coverage or attending one of the public panels featuring Burns and Novak is likely to conclude that the new documentary has equaled the Civil War in historical and artistic virtuosity. But if one listens to American or South Vietnamese veterans of the conflict, more easily heard today, thanks to the internet, the verdicts are less complimentary. During the months-long publicity blitz preceding the documentary's release, Burns and Novak vowed that the Vietnam War would not malign American veterans or blame them for the war, as had happened so often in the past. Instead, the film would portray veterans as patriotic Americans who answered the nation's call to duty. The documentary would support the troops without necessarily supporting the war. I've always had a question about how that works. As for the war itself, the production would not promote a particular viewpoint. We don't have an agenda, Burns told the media. We're just umpires calling balls and strikes. So why aren't veterans as enthused about the Vietnam War as they should be? The foremost reason is that Burns and Novak are not actually impartial referees, but instead use the documentary to promote an agenda in ways glaringly obvious to veterans, though not readily apparent to those too young to have lived through the war. Burns and Novak wish to show that Americans fought a war that was unnecessary and unwinnable, and that it did so out of national hubris. With the consistency of a jackhammer, the documentary highlights the events most conducive to a negative interpretation of American involvement, while ignoring those supporting more positive interpretations. During 1962 and 1963, for instance, the Vietnamese communists lost nearly every battle, yet the only battle from this period that Burns and Novak covered is the communist victory at Outback. Compounding the distortion, the documentary characterizes Outback as historically representative, which it was not. During 1966 and 1967, American forces inflicted hundreds of lopsided defeats of the North Vietnamese. But the 6 battles that Burns and Novak featured in the episode devoted to those years belonging to a small minority of engagements where both the American and North Vietnamese forces suffered heavy losses. In the battle that it covers, the documentary takes little note of the heroism of American veterans, aside from a few fleeting references. Nothing is said of the 259 Americans who won the Congressional Medal of Honor, or the tens of thousands who won other combat awards, or the many more whose valor was recognized only by their comrades. Burns and Novak further misled through selective use of tape recordings of the Nixon administration. Those who hear only the excerpts presented here will conclude that for reasons of political self-interest, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were planning to stand by the South Vietnamese until 1972 election and then cut them loose soon thereafter. Historian Luke Nixter, a leading authority on the Nixon tapes, has faulted Burns and Novak for excerpting carefully chosen segments of the tape to fit a preconceived notion or larger points sometimes taken out of context. While not giving evidence to the contrary a similar degree of attention, as Nixter notes, Nixon often expressed multiple positions as he pondered an issue. And many of his words and deeds on the issue of South Vietnam suggested a commitment to the long-term survival of the Saigon government. We Vietnamese have a crystal clear understanding of the reasons why we fought. Nguyen Van Tha and Nguyen Duc Linh wrote in a blistering critique of the PBS series, "We fought because we understood the cruelty and dictatorship of the communists." There was very little of the South Vietnamese involved in the series. We fought because we did not wish the communists to impose a barbarous and inhuman regime upon us. More than 1 million people from North Vietnam fled their native land and immigrated to the South in 1954 in order to escape totalitarianism. When North Vietnam was divided up, or Vietnam was divided up in North Vietnam and South Vietnam, there was a free period of time that people could go from one part of the country, either from the north to the south or the south to the north. And right over 1 million people went south to get away from communism. The second echoes of the 70s and 80s and early 90s also corroborated this fact. While no history of the Vietnam War can be fully satisfy everyone, Burns and Novick could have achieved something closer to the impartial account they promised, presenting facts and stories within the proper context and including contrasting examples that support the competing schools of thought on the war. They could have refrained from taking sides on controversies like the validity of the domino theory, the moral rectitude of the South Vietnamese government, and the merits of American exceptionalism. They could have sought advice from more than a handful of people who did not share their contempt for the war. Burning history. Deception and teaspoon of sand. This was an observation from John Del Vecchio, author of The 13th Valley, and he's a Vietnam veteran. If you haven't read The 13th Valley, I highly recommend it. It's a good read. Riding the Tiger segment was wonderfully produced in propaganda. That was one of the segments of Burns and Allen's was Riding the Tiger. Technically better than episode 1, but it's far more manipulative. If I did not have a bit more of the background information from years of study and writing about Southeast Asia, Burns would have convinced me that Diem, the autocrat, was far worse to his people than Uncle Ho. Diem, the Catholic strongman, ruled a gentle Buddhist nation, cracked down on Buddhist homes of worship. Ho, the sweet old man, who despite other leaders in his fraction have gotten a bit out of hand by murdering between 50 and 500,000 of their countrymen, was far more of a gentleman. To give you a real quick rundown, there were a group of Buddhists who were more for the communist regime, and not all of the Buddhists, and Diem, who was the president or prime minister at the time, did attack those Buddhists there, but not the Buddhist nation. But that wasn't explained. Burns is very convincing. I cannot imagine anyone other than those with relatively deep subject knowledge not being completely taken in by everything shown. We were softly set up by episode 1 and episode 2 of the filmmaker skillfully weaves the story and sucks us further in. Episode 3 was worse yet. There, with original sin, became the narrators crafting stories to forever convert their tracks. Even with some depth of background in the subject, I had to recheck some of my sources to make sure I wasn't overstating my case. I found that programming so convincing. After spending hours rereading, my anger at his omissions and skewing the story grew to a rage. That's why we are concerned about the story of the Vietnam War, and those of us who were involved in it going out as the gospel of what went on and so forth, was that it was so good that those who have spent most of their lives after they left Vietnam studying and researching the war and so forth. Okay, now moving right along to a different subject. By the way, if you would like to more of that, see more about Ken Burns's situation, so forth, you can go back and pick up one of the shows we did. I believe we did 2 parts on the Ken Burns documentary. I think you'll find it interesting. A lot of veterans who have done a lot of research in the past put their 2 cents worth in. Now, moving along, there are 8 women listed on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. They were all volunteers, they were all nurses, and all gave all. And put it this way, there were 7 Army nurses and 1 Air Force nurse that are on the wall. Now, the only people on the wall that are the women on the wall are all military. There were more women killed, but the only ones that were there. This is the Vietnam Women's Memorial. There were a lot of women who served in Vietnam who were not nurses. And supposedly this memorial depicts the nurses as well as the women who served other roles in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam Women's Memorial was dedicated in 1993 to honor those women who served, but also for the families that lost loved ones in the war. That's right off from the walls. If you get a chance to go to the wall in DC, be sure to go over and see that, along with the Korean Memorial. During the years of the Vietnam War, 265,000 women served in the American Armed Forces. Of those, nearly 11,000 volunteered and served in Vietnam. Now that all of those 265,000 women did not go to Vietnam. 11,000 volunteered and served in Vietnam. There was right at 9,000 people who served during the period of Vietnam. There was less than 3,000 of us who actually set foot on the ground. Total numbers are not known, but many civilian women served in varied roles in Vietnam throughout our war. Many of these women were wounded, and most spent time in bunkers during attacks, as well as endured extreme hardships of daily life in a war zone. 75 total women known to have lost their life as a result of Vietnam service. 67 civilians and 8 military, only military names on the wall. So this is some of them. This one, this lady was from Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Graham. She was chief nurse at the 91st Evac Hospital in Tuiwa. Colonel Graham from Effingham, North Carolina, suffered a stroke in August 1968, was evacuated to Japan, where she died 4 days later. A veteran of both World War II and Korea, she was 52 years old. She is listed on the wall at 48 West, line 43. Number 7 is Second Lieutenant Elizabeth A. Jones. She was 51st Field Hospital, attached to the 3rd Field Hospital, 68th Med Group, 44th Medical Battalion, Army, 18th of February, 1966, from Allendale, South Carolina. She's on the wall at panel 5 East, line 47. Lieutenant Jones was assigned to the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon. She died with Lieutenant Elizabeth Drosba in a helicopter crash near Saigon. Both were 22 years old. This is the other nurse that was killed in the helicopter crash. Second Lieutenant Carol Ann Elizabeth Drosba. She was also assigned to the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon. And she died in a helicopter crash near Saigon, February 18th, 1966. Like the other nurse was, she's on 5 East, line 46. Right there with the other nurse. This is the only one that was actually killed by combat. First Lieutenant Sharon Ann Lane. Lieutenant Lane died from shrapnel wounds when the 312th Evacuation Hospital in Chulai was hit by rockets on June 8, 1969. She's from Canton, Ohio. She was a month short of her 26th birthday. She was posthumously awarded the Vietnamese Gallantry Cross with Palm and the Bronze Star for heroism. In 1970, the recovery room at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver, where Lieutenant Lane had been assigned before going to Vietnam, was dedicated into her honor. She is listed on 23 West on the wall, line 112. Captain Grace Alexander, 85th Evac Hospital, 44th Medical Battalion, United States Army Republic of Vietnam. She was from Riverdale, New Jersey. Captain Alexander of Westwood, New Jersey, okay, and Lieutenant Orlowski of Detroit, Michigan, died November 30th, 1967. Alexander stationed at the 85th Evacuation Hospital, and Orlowski, stationed at the 67th Evacuation Hospital in Quinong, had been sent to a hospital in Pleiku to help out during a push. With them, with their plane crashed on the returning trip to Quinong, were 2 other nurses, Jerome E. Olmsted of Clintonville, Washington, and Kenneth R. Shoemaker, Jr. of Orangeburg, Kentucky. Alexander was 27, Orlowski, 23. Both were posthumously awarded the Bronze Stars. They 4 were killed in a plane crash. We had 2 that killed in a helicopter crash. So wherever you were, the nurses were always in danger from getting hit there. Lieutenant Diane Orlowski. She was the 67th Evac Hospital, 67th Medical Group. Captain Alexander Westwood, New Jersey, and Lieutenant Orlowski of Detroit, Michigan, died November 30th, 1967. Alexander stationed at the 85th Evacuation Hospital, and Orlowski stationed at the 67th Evacuation Hospital in Quinong. And they were sent to Pleiku, and the plane crashed on the return trip to Quinong. And there were 2 other nurses, both of them male. The lieutenant listed on panel 31 East, line 15. So if you're facing the wall, the east is going to be on the left side, excuse me, the right side, and the west side is on the left side facing it. Lieutenant Pamela D. Donovan, 85th Evacuation Hospital. Lieutenant Donovan from Austin, Massachusetts, became seriously ill and died on July 8, 1968. She was assigned to the 85th Evacuation Hospital in Quinyon. She was 26 years old. Ireland-born Lieutenant Donovan became a U.S. citizen so that she could join the Army Nurse Corps. She attended schools in Ireland, England, and Canada. The Newton County Day School alumni graduated from St. Elizabeth Hospital School of Nursing and became a registered nurse in 1965. Became American citizen, so she could go to Vietnam, and was killed 3 years later. She is listed on the panel of the wall at 53 West, line 43. Air Force Captain Mary Therese KLINKER. Captain KLINKER, a flight nurse assigned to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, was on the C-5A Galaxy, which crashed on April 4th outside Saigon, while evacuating Vietnamese orphans under Operation Baby Lift. From Lafayette, Indiana, Captain KLINKER was 27. She was posthumously awarded the Airman's Medal for Heroism and the Meritorious Service Medal. She's listed 1 West, 122. As the war was coming down to an end, they were taking children out of the orphanage, putting them on planes to evacuate them to safety. The first airplane taking off of Operation Baby Lift was crashed. There's been some conversation that it was booby trapped, had a bomb on it or whatever, but either way, it crashed, and some were survivors and some were killed. But that's another story that you might want to check into, Operation Baby Lift, or see the show 8 on the Wall. Okay. Now let's talk about Martha Ray. You young people out there probably never heard of Martha Ray. Thus, more seasoned seniors knew her as a comedian. She was quite a slapstick type of comedian, but also she was one of the most courageous volunteers, non-military, that you'll ever find. Martha Ray, born August 27th, 1916, and October 9th, 1994, when she died, was an American comic, actress, and singer who performed in movies and later on television. She was honored in 1969 with the Academy Award as the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award, recipient for her volunteer efforts and service to the troops. She is a colonel, if you see her epaulet on her collar there. She received the honorary colonel on several different occasions. Beyond being an entertainer who went to the camps that no other entertainer went to, Martha Ray was also a trained nurse. Questionable how much training, but who interrupted her shows to render medical aid to the wounded. She would go to any fire base, anywhere in Vietnam, and visit a troop and show no fear, always supporting the teams. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award of our government to entertain and humanitarian Martha Ray. You can see it there. But we just talked about how she go to any fire base. Martha Ray had a lifelong fear of flying, but because of her profession and her love for her Green Beret, she was required to make numerous air trips. Now, she was known to be very inebriated to make these trips. That's how she got through it, these long flights. Martha Ray did USO tours where some celebrities refused to go out of fear in Vietnam. Martha Ray won the hearts and souls of the Green Berets while she was there. Later in life, the governor of California made her an honorary lieutenant colonel in the California National Guard in honor of her service in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. When Colonel Maggie died, She was buried in the military cemetery at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in accordance with her wishes. The Green Berets lined up to put her to be her honorary pallbearers. Guys placed so many special forces coins in her coffin that had a hard time lifting up at her wake. Now, I have been to Martha Ray's grave site. It is right there with the Green Berets at Fort Bragg, where she was. She supported them so much, and they loved her so much. Now, let's talk about the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin was what got us involved in the Vietnam War with sending troops in. Kind of, sort of happened, maybe could have. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is the purported catalyst for the escalation of American action in Vietnam. It refers to two incidents in August 1964. On August 2nd, the destroyer USS Maddox was shelled by NVA torpedo boats. The Maddox responded by firing over 280 rounds in return. There was no official response from the Johnson administration from that confrontation. Now, let's go back and talk about this one for just a second. August the 2nd, the USS Maddox was offshore of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. At the time, the South Vietnamese were attacking some of the bases along the shoreline there. And so the Maddox was kind of involved there to a certain extent with what was going on. Now, on August 4th, the second incident was said to have happened. But Secretary McNamara admitted in Errol Morris's 2003 documentary, The Fog of War, the second attack never occurred. The Pentagon papers even implied that Maddox fired first in an effort to keep the communists a certain distance away. If you read Admiral Stockdale's history, he was one of the ranking NCOs there in Hanoi Hilton. He was actually flying his airplane, one of his jets, above it, and he was asking, what the hell are the Americans shooting at? Because he couldn't see anything. The admiral on board, or captain of the ship, actually radioed back Washington that he was not certain that anything happened, that he needed some more investigation. The resulting Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed by the U.S. Congress allowed Johnson to deploy conventional ground U.S. troops and operate in a state of open but undeclared war against North Vietnam. There is a myth that the average age of U.S. soldiers killed in Vietnam was 19 years of age, but the true figure is actually 22. Still young, but not as a teenager, and still younger than World War II. 11,465 of the personnel who were killed were under the age of 20. The youngest man to die in Vietnam War, American, was 15 years old, Dan Bullock, who was born in Goldsboro, and he was buried in Goldsboro. He joined the Marines at 14. He lied about his age, told him he was 26, and he was youngest. The M16 jammed so much. That was the new rifle they gave out during the Vietnam War. Jammed so much, U.S. troops preferred the AK-47. Now, the problem with the AK-47 and M16 is they sounded different when they fired. Now, you might pick up the enemy's AK-47 and use it, but then if you're in heavy jungle and your buddies hear the AK-47 going off instead of the M16, they very well be shooting your way. So it wasn't as simple as idea as that. General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam, replaced the M14 rifle with the new M16s as the standard issue infantry rifle in the middle of 1966. When I was in Vietnam, I carried the M14. I liked the M14, but it was long and cumbersome and heavy. And if you were in thick underbrush, it was very hard to bring it up because it was so long and so forth. So what was causing the problem with the M16? Let's talk about it. There was no fanfare. Their first generation, the M16 rifle, was an awful mess with a tendency to experience a jam in the middle of a firefight, which is not a good time to jam. Not only that, but the plastic stock was made by a Mattel toy company, and had the company logo on the stock, causing some troops to believe the rifle was by Mattel. The bullets would get stuck in there, and you'd almost need like the old flintlocks where you had to jam the shells down the barrel. They were hated so much, the Army was questioned by Congress in 1967 for delivering such a terrible rifle system and then failing to properly train troops to use it. The investigation by Congress found several problems with the lack of cleaning supplies and the powder used in the bullets. They bought the rifle, but they didn't buy the bullets. The man who designed and built the M16 used a low residue powder in the bullets. The American government used the high resolution powder, so the extra powder was left over in the jungle, humid regions of Vietnam. Just got in there and glued everything up like glue. More of the men who fought in Vietnam weren't drafted; they volunteered. Now I know we hear all about World War II, how everybody just beat the door down to get and join after Pearl Harbor and so forth. But most of the men who fought in Vietnam weren't drafted; they volunteered. More than 3/4 of the men who fought in Vietnam volunteered to join the military. Of the roughly 8.7 million troops who served in the military between 1965 and 1973, only 1.8 million were drafted. Now look at those numbers. That's right at 7 million, just under 7 million men and women who joined the military during the Vietnam War. 2.7 million of those in the military fought in Vietnam at this time. Only 25% of that 2.7 million were drafted, and only 30% of the combat deaths in the war were draftees. In contrast, during World War II, 2/3 of the men were drafted. That sure dispels a lot of history we've been taught, isn't it? 2/3 of the men were drafted. And in Vietnam, 3/4 volunteered. Okay? Just put that in your hat and smoke it for a little while. Y'all remember the Slinky toy? Slinkies were used in the Vietnam War as mobile radio antennas. They would sling the Slinky over branches and extend ranges of their radios. Duct tape. The good old duct tape. You can fix anything with duct tape. Duct tape was used during the Vietnam War to repair helicopter rotor blades. I tell you, I used duct tape to tape my pant legs together to keep the leeches out of my boots and so forth. Didn't wear the legging blousers, but you take the tape and put it around your pant legs against your boots, pour a little insect repellent through it, and it sure helped the leeches from getting up in there. So it's all kinds of interesting stuff for duct tape. We just kind of figured out what worked best and used it. Super glue was used during the Vietnam War to slow bleeding until soldiers could get to a hospital. Now, from what I understand, that was one of the main reasons super glue came about, was to kind of help close up the wounds. During the Vietnam War, an estimated 120,000 Americans fled to Canada to avoid the military draft. Around half returned to the U.S. when President Carter, in his first day in office, granted them amnesty. Of the 2.7 million military personnel who served in Vietnam, only 1 of every 10 served as combat troops. 9 of those 10 supported the combat troops, such as administration, supply and its many components, medical, transportation, mechanical, engineering, planning, and logistics. In order for those combat troops to have uniforms, to be taken care of when they're wounded, to eat, have engineering, to get the stuff there when it was needed to be there, there were other troops there who put their lives on the line, pretty much just like quite often as the combat troops or the grunts. There's a lot of controversy today that some of the grunts think there was nobody in Vietnam but them, but if they ate, wore clothes, got medical attention, and had bullets and so forth, there was somebody out there in the field with them. But any one of those 10 could be very well find themselves fighting for their life, as there was no really safe place to be in Vietnam. The Vietnam Memorial Wall has etched into its face the names of all types of men and women and the many jobs they perform. The wall does not just have grunts. It has every man and woman who died in Vietnam. fighting for their country. Desertion. You would think with all the drugs and all the things that were going on, we were all crazy. We were all against the war over there and so forth. You would get the idea that there was a lot of desertions. And what exactly defines desertion? Any member of the armed forces who, without authority, goes on or remains absent from his unit, organization, or place of duty with the intent to remain away therefrom permanently. In other words, if you got a weekend pass and you didn't show back up, you were listed as a deserter. If you went on R&R and got too drunk and missed your plane, you were listed as a deserter. Quits his unit, organization, or place of duty with intent to avoid hazardous duty or to shrink important service. That could be the same thing. Got sick or got drunk or just decided. There wasn't a whole lot of places that you could go to if you think about Vietnam. There was a couple of streets in Saigon that people could hide out pretty good in. Probably Da Nang and Quang Tri had some also. Without being regularly separated from one of the armed forces, enlist or accept an appointment in the same or other one of the armed forces without fully disclosing the fact that he has not been regularly separated or enters any foreign army service except when authorized by the United States is guilty of desertion. In other words, if you're fighting in Vietnam and you decide you want to join the French Foreign Legion and you don't tell the American soldiers, the American government that you're going to do that, then you're a deserter. Now, what's the penalty for desertion? We've always heard that you get shot in a firing squad or hung, but is that really the truth? Any person found guilty of desertion or attempt to desert shall be punished if the offense is committed in time of war by death or such other punishment as a court-martial may direct. But a desertion or attempt to desert occurs at any other time by such punishment other than death as a court-martial may direct. In other words, if you desert during a time of war, the punishment is death. If you desert in not a time of war, then they'll decide what your punishment is. However, in the United States before the Civil War, deserters from the Army were flogged. After 1861, tattoos or branding were also used. I've seen some of the old movies where they branded the guy with a big B on his chest or whatever. The maximum U.S. penalty for desertion in wartime remains death, although this punishment was last applied to Eddie Slovic, who was a United States Army soldier during World War II and the only American soldier to be court-martialed in 1945 and executed for desertion since the American Civil War. In other words, nobody has been executed for desertion since 1945, and Eddie Slovic was the lucky person to get that number. No U.S. serviceman has received more than 24 months imprisonment for desertion or missing movements post-September 11, 2001. 24 months of imprisonment. Vietnam War Deserters by Philip Giraldi. During the Vietnam War, nearly 420,000 soldiers deserted, which means they left their post without any intent to return or failed to show up for deployment. Now, let me go back and read this to you because it's important to look at the difference. During the Vietnam War, nearly 420,000 soldiers deserted. That is not saying that 420,000 soldiers in Vietnam deserted. It was 420-some thousand of the nearly 9 million who served during that period of time. Those who were gone for more than a month were administratively categorized as having deserted. But I also know people who went to their duty station or waited at home for orders to what duty station to go, and they never came in. So the government kind of forgot about them and all the red tape and so forth. A lot of paperwork involved. Some were caught, some were able to change their names and keep a low profile to avoid attention in the United States, while still others disappeared in the black market economy of Southeast Asia, sometimes selling drugs and weapons, and some of them also went to Canada. Some who were caught were tried, but most were dealt with administratively. In other words, they never passed the company clerk and the commander. None were executed. Over the course of the Vietnam War, the United States Army Stockade at Long Binh, or Long Binh Jail, as we call it, nicknamed LBJ, and the Marine Brig in Da Nang incarcerated 1,000 U.S. military personnel. Now, you could be there for just about anything, not having a haircut, failing to recognize an officer, punching an officer in the face, all kinds of things, killing a civilian, killing another a soldier. You could be at LBJ. I can tell you from being on the outside looking in, you did not want to be there. But those were the two main jails. There were some smaller ones, but those were the two main jails that locked up soldiers during the Vietnam War. Both of them were overrun at one time or another by too many people and so forth. There was a big riot at Long Binh Jail. I believe it was around 69. It was after I left. Okay. But this is some of the incentives that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had. Hey, Americans, this girl and $10,000 cash. You do not need to fight your own people. We just need your cooperation in learning your training. In other words, we aren't going to give you a gun necessarily and send you out to fight Americans. We just need you to help coordinate and teach us how to fight against them. You can earn extra cash if you choose to assist in our training or intelligence program. Live in comfort and safety in Europe or Asia. These were the cards that were sent out and left around for the Americans to sign and so forth, out in the jungle, in the bars and so forth. So they had their own propaganda. I don't know how many soldiers actually fell for it. I'm not certain anybody knows, but already it didn't sound that good. September 16, 1974, conditional amnesty for Vietnam draft dodgers and military deserters. President Ford offered a conditional amnesty to Vietnam military deserters and draft dodgers who fled the country. Ford stated that he hoped that the amnesty would finally heal the deep national division the war had caused. Many who had served in Vietnam who had lost loved ones there were outraged. Hundreds of veterans sent President Ford their medals earned in Vietnam and previous wars as gifts of protest, letting them know how much they disapproved of his amnesty, even though it was conditional amnesty. I think you had to reaffirm your citizenship and some other stuff, but okay. A POW twice. Now, we've talked about deserters and so forth. And again, I reflect back, if you'd like to learn more, go to some of the shows we've done over the period of time and watch them and get into more detail. This was an interesting story, I thought. A POW twice, once is enough. In 1942, a young man named Richard Kern turned 18 and joined the United States Army Air Forces. On September 11, 1994, high above the Ural Mountains on the Czech-German frontier, a formation of B-17G flying fortresses, escorted by P-51 Mustang fighters, clashed with the Germans into a ferocious air battle. Kern's plane was hit and the captain ordered everyone to bail out. Kern was taken as a prisoner of war, was held prisoner until the camp was liberated just after victory in Europe, VE Day, on May 8, 1945. He was there a little over a year. Kern returned home to start a family, but re-enlisted during the war with Vietnam. 12 days after being in country, Kern filled in for another pilot on sick call and was the commander pilot for a mission over Hanoi. When his Phantom took a hard vertical hit, Kern parachuted to the side of a mountain and was captured the next day. He fractured both ankles, sustained flash burns on his face and upper body, and was carried a piece of shrapnel in his leg until he was released. This is a picture of Captain Richard P. Kern, POW, in Hanoi in 1965. Okay. Kern spent the next 7 years as a POW until finally returning home in February of 1973. He retired as a colonel in June of 1976 after 33 years in the service. Now, as a POW in World War II, his nickname was Junior because he was one of the youngest officers. As a POW in Vietnam, his nickname was Pop because he was one of the older than most and was viewed as a fatherly figure. He cared for many of the POWs while in camp, and many attributed their survivors to his guidance. He'd been there, done it before, knew that it would end eventually, and he worked with the young prisoners there and helped keep them going. POW twice. Now let's talk about another POW. Ernest Brace was the longest serving civilian prisoner of war in Vietnam that we know of. Ernest C. Brace was a Marine Corps pilot who was decorated for combat services in Korea. Then was court-martialed for desertion after a stateside plane crash and later was celebrated for his fortitude as the longest-held civilian POW in Vietnam. That's kind of a mixture of he's a hero and he's a bum, all in the same sentence just about. By his early 20s, Mr. Brace was a seasoned, accomplished pilot. He flew more than 100 missions in Korea, including one in which he encountered heavy enemy fire, was forced to crash land in the Sea of Japan, where a U.S. ship rescued him. For those actions, Mr. Brace received the Distinguished Flying Cross. In January 1961, he was a captain enrolled in an officer's training course at Quantico, Virginia. When a plane he was piloting crashed on Maryland's eastern shore, Mr. Brace abandoned the scene, reportedly hitchhiked to Baltimore, and turned himself in 10 days later after authorities discovered his discarded flight suit. He stated at the time that he was burdened by domestic and financial problems and hoped to get away from it all. Law enforcement officials alleged that he had attempted to fake his own death in order to allow his family to collect on life insurance policy. Mr. Brace insisted that the plane had malfunctioned, and a federal jury acquitted him of purposely destroying the government aircraft. A Marine Corps court-martial convicted him of desertion and sentenced him to punitive dismissal. He was a man who loved the Marines, loved flying, but situations he made bad choices. Mr. Brace later became a civilian contract pilot who ferried supplies and passengers into Laos during the Vietnam War. On May 21st, 1965, Communist forces attacked his plane on a Laotian airstrip. He was captured and taken to the jungle prison where he would begin his 7 years, 10-month, and 1 week in enemy hands. I'm going to tell you about his book in a minute, but I highly recommend you get it. It is a fantastic read. The man kept right on escaping. That period, to recall, would be spent mostly encaged in a small bamboo cage to be beaten, starved, buried alive, and humiliated as few modern-day humans have known. They buried him up to his neck and left him for days. Mr. Brace was said to have repeatedly attempted to escape. After one effort, he was buried up to his neck for a week. He recalled that he endured more than 4 years of solitary confinement. Once he recalled he attempted to choke himself. He eventually was transferred to the Wallow complex in North Vietnam. One of the reasons that happened was the Song Tay raid, the successful failure. They started bringing in all the captives into Hanoi. Where the taps, while there, he learned how to do the tap system and further match the transmission between cells. The wall was like a confessional, Mr. Brace recalled. The person on the other side existed in voice only. You couldn't talk a whole lot, but they had the tap code that they come up with, which is interesting in itself. On March 28, 1973, Mr. Brace was released. In 1974, President Gerald R. Ford granted Mr. Brace a full pardon, in part through efforts by John McCain, who happened to be on the other side of the wall when he came into the prison. He received the Purple Heart and the Prisoner of War Medal. His book, A Code to Keep, I highly recommend you read it. I was just thinking about rereading it because it's amazing what this man went through. The Hanoi Hilton prisoners were treated bad, but if you read the stories of the men and women, most of the men who were captured and held in the jungles of Vietnam or South Vietnam or Laos, their stories are unbelievable. Okay? Now, the rules of engagement. It's hard to believe, but during the war, there are rules to go by. And we had some pretty stiff rules of engagement. Uh, Vietnam rules of engagement, which set the conditions under which U.S. soldiers, Marines, and airmen could engage the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese enemy. The rules of engagement were fully declassified in 1985, more than 10 years after the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. One of the reasons for that, Senator Barry Goldwater, a Republican from Arizona, I found out about him and read them. I think it was like 27 pages or so. And he gave the following speech on the floor of the United States Senate, March 6, 1985, upon declassification of the Vietnam Rules of Engagement. Okay. That's his, Senator Barry Goldwater. This is his speech. Mr. President, U.S. military forces have been much maligned by some people in this country who blame the military for what they call loss of the war in Vietnam. However, the armed forces did not suffer a military defeat in any sense of that term. Rather, it was the civilian managers of the U.S. government who denied our military forces a victory by imposing a complex and lengthy set of restrictions on what the military could and could not do in South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam. And it goes on to say, these layers of restrictions, which were constantly changing and were almost impossible to memorize or understand. You may be in your airplane and go out, and they may change while you're flying. Although it was required of our pilots, granted huge sanctuary areas to the enemy. When certain limits would at least be removed after the repeated appeals by the Joint Chiefs, reductions were made only in gradual steps and seldom were strong enough to serve our strategic ends. Numerous partial and total bombing halts interrupted the effectiveness of earlier bombing campaigns. Often when limited extensions of target areas were granted, they were unexpectedly canceled and withdrawn shortly afterwards. In other words, you would have orders to go bomb this place, and while you were flying there, they were canceled. So you didn't know exactly for certain what you were going to do. Mr. President, this is continuing on Barry Goldwater's speech. Mr. President, in the interest of informing the American people and any journalists who are interested in the truth of what really prevented a military victory in Southeast Asia, I have asked several secretaries of defense to declassify the pertinent records, the actual text of the rules which restrain military conduct in the Vietnam War. I am delighted to inform my colleagues that Secretary Weinberger has now agreed with me that it would be useful to declassify the remaining Vietnam rules of engagement. He and Assistant Secretary of Defense Armitage recently provided me with several volumes of papers which were formerly classified top secrets, but now have been declassified. These newly public documents clearly reveal the excessive restraints our military units had to operate under in Vietnam. For example, one rule told American pilots they were not permitted to attack a North Korean MiG sitting on the runway. The only time it could be attacked was after it was in flight, was identified and showed hostile intentions. Even then, its base could not be bombed. The same hostile intention rule applied to truck convoys driving on highways in Laos and North Vietnam. In some regions, enemy trucks could attack by simply driving off the road. Military trucks located just 200 yards away from the road could not be destroyed. Another rule provided that SAM missile sites could not be struck while they were under construction, but only after they became operational. If you'd like to see a list of the rules of engagement, I highly recommend you go to the website of Vietnam Veterans for Factory History. A lot of these men are a friend of mine, and they go in and have done research and can tell you the true stories of what goes on, just like I'm trying to do here. That's Vietnam Veterans for Factory History, their website. They push out a newsletter from time to time, sign up for it, but they also have a list of these and many of the rules of engagement, which you would not really believe. Now, let's talk about Black April, or the day of the infamy, April 30th, 1975. The fall of Saigon to North Vietnamese, supported by Russians and Chinese forces. In the year following the fall of Saigon, the communists exacted a cruel revenge on hundreds of thousands of its citizens in extensive networks of what they call re-education camps. The communists kept the news media out of South Vietnam and built show re-education camps for when they allowed visiting reporters in for a controlled visit. In other words, they didn't show them the real education camps. As one former prisoner said, they did not want to re-educate us, they wanted vengeance. Another former prisoner stated the communists practiced genocide. They decided who they wanted to kill, worked them very hard, fed them nothing, and let disease do the rest. I have talked with several of my friends who were South Vietnamese soldiers who were held in re-education camps, and it's hard to believe just they could get through. You can see the gentleman there. There has been estimated over 65,000 people were being executed in the 8 years after the fall of Saigon. There were as many as 500,000 people placed in estimated 300 camps throughout Vietnam. Now, we talk about the Viet Cong. A lot of the Viet Cong ended up in these re-education camps also, because a lot of the Viet Cong, I would say a majority of the Viet Cong, were nationalists. They wanted Vietnam to be one country. But then the communists are the ones who took over. So the nationalists were also sent to these re-education camps to be re-educated to be a good communist. The Vietnamese communists have called the reports of brutality in the camps distorted and fabricated. They stated, we pursued a benevolent and very humane policy towards the prisoners. They went on to say, there are, of course, regulations in any camp. If they are violated, it is necessary to ensure they are respected. But we are against torture. We punish torture. But on the other hand, prisoners must be punished who try to escape or destroy discipline in the camp. And you can see them pull a man out of a hole there, getting ready to put him in a box. To re-educate them is to help them to realize their crimes, to offer them an opportunity to listen, to reason, and to reform themselves into honest-minded people, thus contributing to the common cause of national reconstruction. Hanoi said, we have done nothing wrong by imprisoning the losing side of the war. It's Vietnam's right to punish these criminals as European countries did with Hitler's people. They killed so many of their own people. Now, if communism and socialism is so wonderful for the people, why did so many Vietnamese people from the North and South risk their lives to escape? And as the book says there, the world looked away. There were people getting on boats overloaded. There were people getting on boats where pirates got. There were people getting on boats that other people came along and threw them overboard and took the boats. You can see the anguish on the Mama San's picture there. You can see the people trying to escape. They're trying to escape socialism and escape communism. The draft. Congress, by the way, that's Elvis Aaron Presley's selective service card, where he registered for the draft. Congress passed the first Military Conscription Act in 1863 during the Civil War, allowing President Abraham Lincoln to draft men between the age of 20 and 45. Our nation's second military draft law, the Selective Service Act, went into effect in 1917 and gave President Woodrow Wilson the authority to conscript men for World War I. The Draft Act of 1873 was the first instance of compulsory service in the federal military services. All male citizens, as well as aliens, who had declared the intention of becoming citizens between 20 and 45 were at risk of being drafted. No married men could be drafted until all the unmarried had been taken. Two methods of aiding a draft were available. A man could hire a substitute who would serve in his place, or he could simply pay $300 to get out of the obligation. Rioting on Lexington Avenue in New York City following the first published draft call in 1863. And you thought we were the first draft dodgers. The lower class resented this system. Resistance and anger were especially fierce in northern cities where larger groups of immigrants lived. Some of the anger had been fueled by a Democratic Party whose leaders doubted the wisdom of the war and hated Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was too old for the draft, and being president would have been exempt regardless of age. But the army was short of men, and his commander-in-chief wanted to encourage other ineligible like himself to voluntarily hire a substitute. To that end, in 1864, he paid Representative Recruit to fight for him. The document held in the National Archives records the enlistment of 19-year-old Pennsylvanian J. Somerville Staples at Lincoln's request. Lincoln paid him $500 to take his place in the Civil War. That was done after and during World War II and Vietnam for a while there under the table. North and South, each side was compelled to resort to conscription. The South instituted a draft in 1862. They ended up anywhere from 70 to 50 years old. They did allow a lot of exemptions. As the United States had a peacetime army of just over 100,000 men, the reinstitution of conscription was an unsurprising result of the U.S. entry into World War I on April 17th. The Select Service Act signed by President Woodrow Wilson, May 18th, 1917, created a selective service system, which was to manage the induction of some 2.8 million into armed forces over the next 2 years. And it also did away with the bounty system or substitution system. Initially targeting male citizens aged 21 to 30, the draft was eventually expanded to include all able-bodied men 18 to 45. American Armed Forces demobilized after the armistice of November 8, 1918, and the number of men under arms diminished to pre-war levels. With World War II raging in Europe and Asia, Congress narrowly passed the Selective Training and Service Act, instituted the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the bill into law on September 16, 1940, and all males 18 to 36 were required to register with the resurrected Selective Service System, although for the first time, provisions were officially made for conscientious objectors. Some 45 million men registered, and more than 10 million were inducted through the Selective Service System before November 1940 and October 1946. Now, that was done also kind of on the lottery. To process the registration, administration, the draft local boards, they used local, whatever city you were from, basically ended up as your draft board. Each of the 6,433 boards assigned each of the registrants in its district a number. Then a national lottery was held to rank the registrants. In Washington papers, within the numbers 1 through 7,836 printed on them were put into a capsule, one number to a capsule. The capsules were dumped in a giant fishbowl and was used, and they used a beam from the Philadelphia Independence Hall to stir them up. Finally, the capsules were drawn from the bowl one by one to establish a draft order in a predictable photo opportunity. Secretary of War Henry Stimson reached into the bowl and pulled out the first capsule. From a nearby podium, Franklin Roosevelt announced the number drawn, 158. Across the country, 6,175 young men held that number. All the men holding numbers 158 were brought in first by the local draft boards to be considered for service. Men holding the numbers that followed in the lottery were brought in until the services had their fill. All the men whose numbers were up received an order to report for induction from the local draft board. The letter named the branch of service the man was being called to and gave the date, time, and place where paperwork be filled out and examinations given. A man had to be at least 5 feet tall and no taller than 6.5 feet, but be at least 105 pounds, have vision correctable with glasses, have at least half of his teeth, and not have been convicted of a crime, and be able to read and write. And I think they got a lot that didn't read and write. There were several reasons a man might be sent home. Men who didn't pass the medical examination were classified well, physically unfit for service. Black men were passed over initially due to prejudiced questions about their ability to fight and worries that tension between black and white servicemen might erupt. Men in certain occupations deemed essential to the war effort were excused so they could continue to do their work. And men with friends on the local draft board sometimes slipped through the cracks. The inductees who passed all the scrutiny were taken into service right away. Drafting continued throughout the war. A lot changed after the first round in 1940. Went from 18 to 37, and the growth of enlisted term to the duration of the war plus 6 months. In other words, you had to stay in the service the whole time while the war was going on and at least 6 months afterwards. And that was through the lottery system. The Selective Training and Service Act expired in March 1947, but President Harry S. Truman asserting that the peacetime Army could not attract the numbers that it needed to uphold its global commitment to push the extension of the draft. Congress agreed, and the Selective Service Act was reactivated in June of 1948. A flood of volunteers prompted the Civil Service System to unofficially suspend the act with the draft holiday until early 1949. During the Vietnam War, President Lyndon Johnson chose not to run for re-election in 1968, and the following year, his successor, President Richard M. Nixon, signed an amendment to the Military Service Act that returned selection by lottery to the draft process for the first time since World War II. While this was portrayed as more equitable than the existing system of conscription by age, in which the oldest member were given eligibility pool, were first selected, public opinion had already soured on the draft. Between 1965 and 1973, some 1.7 million were inducted in armed forces throughout the selective service system. That is, in 1969, we went from the draft to the lottery. The lottery drawing, the first since 1942, was held on December 1st, 1969 at Selective Service Headquarters in Washington. And registrants were born between January 1st, 1944 and December 31st, 1940. Reinstitution of the lottery was a change from the draft, the oldest man first method, which had been determined method for deciding order of call. There were 366 blue plastic capsules containing birth dates placed in a large glass container and drawn by hand to assign order of call numbers to all men within the 18 to 26 range. In other words, if they pulled out December 13th, you were born December 13th, you might as well start packing. With radio, film, and TV coverage, the capsules were drawn from the containers open and the dates inside posted in order. So that's how we went from the draft to the lotteries to no draft at all as we have today. The first capsule was drawn by Congressman Alexander Perney from Republican New York. On January 27, 1973, the Department of Defense announced it was suspending the draft, and the military selective service expired at that June. I want to say real quickly, happy birthday to the Navy. Yesterday was the Navy's birthday. Also, our next show will be the 28th of October. If you are interested in writing or some of the other classes like writing, photography, woodwork, and so forth, now with the Zoom and so forth, you can be in California and take a class here. The Joel Fund has got some fantastic classes out there. I'm in process of taking one in writing, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It helps me a whole lot, and not just how much I enjoy it, but deeply emotionally, it gets a lot of it. So I highly recommend you go to the Joel Fund soon, because they've opened up registration for classes. It's $25, and you can't beat the instructions. The writing instructor we have is just out of this world. She's got all kinds of credibility, plays, and so forth. So thank you for tuning in tonight. I hope you enjoyed a recap of some of the old shows. Look forward to seeing you on the 28th, and stay safe. Have a good evening.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.